Let's talk.
John Brown.
The Great Italian Breakout, the most audacious escapes of the Second World War, is a new book by Karen Farrington about one of my favourite subjects in the Second World War. In the whole kaleidoscope was the global conflict. I'm delighted to say that Karen joins us live on the line now, probably from some villa in Tuscany overlooking the rolling hills. Good morning to you, Karen.
Good morning. It's actually from Exmoor, Italy, unfortunately.
Oh, well, it's that Exmoor in Italy, but that will do. Explain a little bit about your background and what you are so eminently qualified to write this book.
Well, I've been a journalist and I've written quite a few books in my time and quite a few World War II books. And I've also been on holiday to Italy. And I was sitting in San Genesio and a beautiful walled town, and was looking at a statue of Alberico Gentili, who was an Enlightenment thinker born in Italy, a Protestant born in Italy, who was driven out of the country and landed up in Oxford. But crucially, it was thanks to him that prisoners of war were afterwards treated humanely. He crystallized that school of thought. They were no longer shoved in dungeons and forgotten about. They were fed, watered, and then freed, treated humanely. At the bottom of this statue, there was a plaque to something called the Monte San Martino Trust, which I Googled, as we do. And I understood then that was an organization devoted to the stories, collecting the stories of 50,000 prisoners of war who escaped, Allied prisoners of war who escaped in Italy after the armistice in September 1943. And I thought, I don't suppose that's right, because I think if 50,000 Allied servicemen had escaped in such a way, I would know about it. But it was right, and I didn't know about it, and that's why I wrote the book.
You see, the thing is, and I have this because my grandfather fought in the Italian campaign, okay? So, if you take the World War II as linear, the narrative tends to go, invasion of Poland by the Nazis, Battle of Britain, Dunkirk, in the sort of jumbled up thing. Then we skip forward to, they might know something about El Alamein, but then we skip forward to D-Day, and then before we know it, we're in Berlin and the war is over. And we completely overlook, or even worse, people say, oh, well, the Italian campaign was a sideshow. And I used to think that until I started reading up on it myself because of many things, including my grandfather, and just went, wow, this is not a sideshow. This is an integral part of and a bloody and in some ways horrendous but an integral part of the Allied strategy and the eventual defeat of the Axis powers, in Second World War.
Absolutely. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think soldiers like your grandfather were branded D-Day dodgers. Allied servicemen who'd been captured mostly in North Africa and were taken over to Italy. They didn't even have a name. They didn't even have an identity. I do think one of the reasons we know so little about the whole campaign, and particularly the escaped prisoners and their stories, and there were thousands of them, and each one different, is because they went home and they didn't feel in a position to talk about it. They didn't get any recognition. They were oft-times ashamed of being taken prisoner in the first place, oft-times left feeling ashamed they didn't escape with thousands of others or were recaptured. So I think it's a tapestry, really, of many stories, many threads coming together. And I think the lack of recognition with the campaign up Italy is absolutely linked to why these thousands of stories have stayed really below the radar for all these years.
And the other thing, of course, is because if you don't know if you think it is purely, evil Nazis against, Saving Private Ryan, which many people will think, you don't realize the complexity in a certain way, the sort of the tragic buffoonery of Mussolini in Italy, the way he decides to, he prevaricates, he hums and haws, and then when the Germans seem to be winning, he joins the Axis, and he decides he's going to sort of reinvent the Roman Empire. So he's going to have the whole Mediterranean basin. He's going to take Cairo. He's already taken Abyssinia, modern day Ethiopia, etc. He's got Tripoli, which is this beautiful Italian style, capital of Northern Africa. But of course, things go very, very badly pear-shaped for him, and basically, we have Operation Husky, you have Operation Torch. The Allies land in Sicily. In short order, they are going through bitter fighting, and the Allies decide that they're going to have an armistice. And there's this almighty muck-up, and I use those words, advisedly, because what happens is obviously, well, you can explain what happens and how these prisoners of war, because it's not like the Great Escape. They're not tunneling out. It is literally a case of this chaos and confusion, and they take the opportunity. Just explain not the whole suite, but in a nutshell, if you can, what happens.
Absolutely. So talks had started around Mussolini's future in the early summer, at least in the early summer of 1943, and he was finally deposed in July 1943. And the Allies were in secret talks after that. Talks obviously always secret and also always known about. And it wasn't until September that the armistice was signed. After that, Italy was no longer, it didn't have Mussolini as a head, and it was no longer fighting the Allies. But that's pretty much as far as the agreement went. And where that left the Italian fighting men was in a terribly precarious position. So they really didn't know who their friends or their foes were. And to be fair, neither did the Germans. They were fighting side by side with the Germans. They looked at one another and thought, well, whose side are you on now? That doesn't excuse the mass slaughter of Italian soldiers. They fought as hard as they could. And thousands of men died in Greece, where they had been fighting with the Germans, were then against the Germans. They had no options, no choices. The Germans said to them, put down your guns. Well, that was against their military code. And the Germans also said to them, well, please fight with us as you have been. But that was against the orders of their king. So they had no space to move in and died in thousands.
And the Italian generals or the higher echelons just look after themselves. I mean, they just flee. They just grab everything. I mean, there are multitudes of stories of them being sort of caught on the side of the road because their Alfa Romeos have broken down or something like that. So it is total confusion. And then obviously the Hitlerian spotlight hits Italy, and as you said, reprisals start. So there's a very, and Mussolini is rescued from his captivity by Ossosconessi, the most dangerous man in Europe, etc. There's this huge sort of commando raid. So there's a very brief window. So is it a question of literally the Italian guys just go, right, I'm off to join the partisans, I'm off to go home, I want to see my mum. Well, I mean, what's the situation?
Just as the Italians were left in a difficult position, so were Allied prisoners of war. So there are instances, there were over 70 prisoner of war camps in Italy containing 80,000 Allied servicemen from all branches of service. And at some of them, the gates merely opened and they could have walked out. At some of them, there were Italian commandants who were absolutely on the side of the Allies and liked the men they were dealing with, and that's when that would have happened. But there were don't be under the impression that fascism disappeared with the deposing of Mussolini, because it didn't, and there were many fascists in charge of prison camps who simply wouldn't open the gates. Now, on top of that, and more confusing still, was an order that had come down from Whitehall in June when the negotiation started with Italy, which is now called the Stay Put Order. And so Whitehall, or we even today, that order has disappeared. We don't know who issued that order, but let's call it Whitehall for now, for our purposes, said, don't move, stay where you are, stay put. The Allies will come up and release you. So serving soldiers were basically in the position of having to make a decision to escape when they had been universally told to stay put. Now, we can look back now and think, well, the common sense view is get the hell out of there. But for some reason, Whitehall decided that the Germans would stay roughly up by the Po or withdraw to the other side. They had two divisions in Italy, would withdraw to the other side of the Po, which is in northern Italy, because they wouldn't want to defend that very curvy, cornered coastline. But they were wrong. Hitler flooded the peninsula with troops. So though some men stayed, some men, a lot of the senior British officers threatened the men under their command with a court-martial if they left the prison where the prison gates were open. The Italians, for their part, a lot of the guards, in the absence of having any other idea, packed up and went home. Yeah. So they're very often the camps didn't have any guards on them. And so men had to decide what they were going to do and how they were going to make a successful escape. But numerically, I think it certainly was the biggest breakout.
And they go sort of in all directions. And there are these, I mean, as you said, Italy is still clawing this. They suddenly didn't go, okay, Mussolini's gone. We're all now enlightened. There are some people who want to, fascism has been going, in Italy since the March of Rome, the Black Shirts March of Rome, 22, 23. So it's not like they're suddenly going, oh, we didn't really mean it. So therefore, it's a very tricky situation out there. They're not going to walk out into the nearest sort of piazza and be greeted by people with flowers because Italy's getting hammered. I mean, absolutely, and it will get worse. I mean, it's appalling what happens to Italy in the Second World War. As the Germans, and we have the Gothic line, etc., and all that sort of thing. But so, are we talking like huge amount? Are they? I suppose this is a very broad brushstroke, but is it small groups of men going right? 3 or 4 going right. We're heading down that road. We're going to try and get to Spain. We're going to try and get to the coast. We're trying to get a boat. Some of them are heading to Rome, aren't they? And trying to throw themselves getting themselves into the Vatican.
Exactly. You've exactly hit the nail on the head there, really, because they had to make quick decisions with pretty much no information. They often didn't really know in the country where they were. So the options were going to Switzerland, and obviously there's a few mountains in the way there. So that had its challenges. To go down to meet the Allies coming up. Confusion again, because as I think most people know, the Allies made a lot of progress and then they stopped. The Germans fortified that winter line, and it was very difficult to get past there. There were fishing boats. The option of fishing boats, obviously, still a risk there. There was an organised effort by, I'm going to call them Whitehall again, the government, to evacuate prisoners on the run, and that had varying degrees of success, and that's outlined in the book. A lot of the men who'd been shipped in from North Africa were marched through Italian towns and were bombarded with rotten fruit, jeered, because they were the enemy, obviously, killing Italian soldiers. So completely understood. So when they escaped, they felt they were very much at risk from the Italian population, both in cities and in villages. That transpired not to be the case. That Mussolini was very much a figurehead. He was not only unpopular in many quarters, but he was also irrelevant to the lives of many people who lived in rural communities.
Sure.
And so where he had really lost popularity was in battles like Stalingrad, which had many, many Italian losses as they rounded up soldiers to throw against the Russians with the Soviet forces. And many died in horrible circumstances there, and their families never saw them or the bodies again. So that made Mussolini very unpopular, and certainly in country areas. So a lot of the soldiers, the Allied soldiers, they walked through open gates or they escaped one way or another, seeing their chances, ran for it. They eventually had to approach local people who could not stay under the radar forever, although some made a remarkable attempt at it. They did approach, initially, I think, rural poor families called in Italian contadini, like shareholders, really.
Yeah.
And they found a warm welcome almost universally. And those people who turned them away because they were threatened with being shot and their houses burnt down. Now, going back to John Tilley, the statue in the square in San Genesio, which first brought me to this story, soldiers that were recaptured, not always, but mostly, were shipped off to prison camps in Germany. The Italians that sheltered them risked being shot. They often were shot. Their families could have been shot and their places were burned down. So they were taking enormous risks. And all of this became apparent as time went by. It wasn't immediately apparent to everyone. And at the background of all of this were Italian fascists who were initially charged with hunting down escapers. As you say, some people headed to Rome and to the Vatican. So the Vatican stayed neutral in the Second World War. And the Pope was extremely aware that German forces could very quickly and very easily overrun it. So he made great efforts to ostentatiously stay neutral. The fact was he was already hiding some escaped prisoners inside the walls of the Vatican. He was also hiding a lot of Jews, Russians, Yugoslavs. A huge effort was being made there, mostly under the auspices of Monsignor Hugh O'Flaherty, who is known, I think, recently as the Scarlet Pimpernel in a rather famous and exciting film with Gregory Peck.
And if you think about it, I mean, and also, I mean, there's people saying, oh, well, you know, we can go off and fight with the partisans. I mean, but again, it is incredibly, there is, if you're Italian, again, because Mussolini has an attraction. You know, you've been basically a sharecropper, if you like, or a smallholder for you know, and the way of life in the Italian mountains it goes unchanged, unchallenged for literally centuries. And you know, the young men have got a choice. They either join the Carabinieri and they become, you know, Italian fascist policemen, or they have to flee into the hills. And you know, it's a lot. You have this romantic view of, you know, the resistance, especially in France. But, you know, in Italy, again, it's brutal. I'm just thinking of the things like the Stella Rossa in Bologna, where literally the whole village is we'd call it ethnic cleansing now. But I mean, women, children, the sick lined up and shot. So it's not a case of that, you know, I've escaped from prison war camp, because again, the men are not in great health either. Even though it's better than being sort of somewhere on the Eastern Front, if you like, but it's still, you know, it's still a tremendously difficult situation for these men. And again, the partisans know if they're caught, they're shot anyway. But if they're caught with Allied prisoners, you know, their fates are even more sealed.
Absolutely. Interestingly, just after September 1943, when the armistice happened, the evidence really across the board is that the partisans were in some places very effective, but in a small number of places. And mostly they were hopeful men, hopeful to gain their revenge against the Germans, hopeful that they would succeed, hopeful that the Allies would make far better progress than they did. But what they mostly wanted was not to be shipped off to Germany as slave labour, because, of course, that was the immense difference between the Axis and the Allies, that our arms and shipments were made by factory workers and theirs were made by slave labour. And I think 650,000 Italians were sent off to Germany to work in shocking conditions, slave labourers for Hitler's various armaments programmes. As time went by, and with some help as well from the Allies, the partisan groups grew better, grew stronger, grew much more effective. They were better armed, had better ideas, and that really did make a difference. And of course, what we're talking about in the after Rome eventually fell to the Allies in the 5th of June, just before D-Day, 1944, which rather overwhelmed that achievement. It was really those in the north who were perhaps more famous and perhaps in a more brutal battle and a more equal battle with the Germans.
How do you? I mean, you can kind of see why stay put would make sense, because if you've got sort of patterns in there, you know, with this pearl-handed revolvers, and we've got the British going up there as well. Italy is, because it's all mountains and windy roads, and so, it's not, especially from the south, it's rural, it's heavily rural, and so it's a terribly difficult campaign. There's only sort of one or two sort of serviceable roads. The Germans are laying ambush. It's very easy because you think of what happened with Monte Cassino, etc. It's a hilltop fortress. It's a monastery. It takes the Allies forever to get over, and that's only one small part of it. And the last thing that the Allied commanders want is a bunch of thousands of Allied prisoners running around, getting in the way, or being strafed by the air superiority of the Allies. So you can kind of see their reasoning. But is there some sort of reaction when they realise? Do they even realise that there are Allied prisoners of war trying to get out?
They very much realised, because as in France, they had quite good intelligence on the ground. They knew that there were thousands of men that needed their help there. So 50,000 men escaped. And I think, I don't think there are any numbers to prove this, but quite a few were recaptured immediately by those advancing Nazi soldiers coming down.
Sure.
They were left. They had they were quite obvious. They were lost in Italy as such, and were quite easy to pick up. So it was those that lasted perhaps for the first 2 weeks who stood the better chance of them getting away, and had a better idea of what they needed. That they met people who helped them. They knew they had to change their clothes. They couldn't be caught in army uniforms. That in itself was actually quite a big decision, because had they been caught in their army uniform, they knew they would have been safe and sent off to Germany, caught out of army uniform, thanks to Hitler's commando order. They felt they would have been shot. In fact, that wasn't always the case. One interesting thing about it is they almost always had to change their boots. British army boots, army-issued boots, very comfortable, very durable, but also a massive giveaway for anyone still wearing them. Sure. and perhaps stuttering over the language. The language itself was a problem, so anyone who had good command of Italian was in far better place than anyone who didn't.
It's interesting because the Americans, of course, when they come up, they've got loads of sort of second or even first generation who've come from Sicily, who've come from the poor areas, so they have a natural advantage, don't they, as they come up?
Absolutely, and there are a number of accounts of soldiers who met people who were very quick to use Americanisms, or actually spoke in broad Glaswegian, because of the Italian diaspora had taken them way overseas. And in many cases, they were visiting home and got caught when the war broke out in 1939, or later, as far as Italy was concerned, in 1940. But it was problematic to travel across the sea. You can imagine that people thought twice about whether to hop on a boat to go back to America.
You've got an ice cream parlour in Glasgow, you nip back to see the family, and the next thing you know, you're stuck in southern Italy. How do you get the information? Because sadly, of course, we there are very few now, because of the passage of time, still alive who were there. So how do you compile this book? Is it through historical memory? Is it through archives? Is it through because again, huge destruction, and for the Italian population, civilian population, I mean, and especially for the women, it is horrendous what they go through. So are many people willing to sort of talk about this?
So I think, going back to where we were previously in the conversation, I think a lot of men weren't willing to talk about it when they came home. Some lucky families had fathers who wrote it all down, and I was fortunate enough to get hold of some unpublished memoirs, for which I'm grateful. I have to say the Monte San Martino Trust, which was started in the 1980s, has a wonderful wealth of accounts, and it's trying to gather as many as it can. It has, I think, several hundred. My argument, and I think theirs, would be that there are thousands still uncovered of those stories. One really important raft of my investigations was the National Archives in London, because every escaper, be it after 2 weeks, 2 months, or 18 months, was debriefed. Now, some of those, all of the accounts of the debriefs are in the National Archives, and I've read a lot. Some of them are very stilted, and that's because they were still under a need to keep secrecy. They weren't allowed to give any names and so forth away. They were allowed to name the Italians that helped them. So you have these accounts in the National Archive with long lists of Italian names. These are the people that helped me. I couldn't have done it. They gave me money. They gave me clothes. They gave me food. They risked everything. And they aren't just the same names. These are just hundreds of names, hundreds of different names. So from the National Archive, I could see a name or an event or something which I could follow up to see whether it had already been written about or to contact families. And I have been hugely helped by families who've given me access to their family archives.
And for those who stayed behind, I mean, was it they would be captured by the Germans and then just sort of marched north? Because we know, obviously, in Northern Europe, they have these horrendous winter marches that happen, Operation Swallow and all that. But is it a case that they literally marched the length of Italy and then into prison and walk?
No, it wasn't. They did go by train, but that of itself was they knew that they were under enormous risk, because as the Allies gained the upper hand, they bombed anything that moved.
Sure.
So a train was prime among them. There was a terrible disaster at Alerona in January 1944 when the Americans bombed a train carrying hundreds of prisoners of war north to Germany, captured prisoners of war, recaptured prisoners of war, north to Germany for prison camps there, and a huge death toll, horrible tales of a train stuck on a bridge, stationary on a bridge, and being shot so carriages tumbled into the river below.
What are you hoping that people will learn from the book?
Well, one thing is, I think, the enormous resourcefulness that prisoners of war had in this situation. I try not to focus just entirely on the successful escapes. I think most books written about this particular era and this event at the moment have focused on successful escapes. And I also wanted to pay tribute to the men who died trying to escape, because it seems to me they've been rather written out of history. So their resourcefulness was extraordinary, and they survived with help, but also thanks to they fell back on every instinct they had to keep their freedom, and their desire to be free was huge.
The book.
Sorry. You go.
No, because we've got 1 minute left. Well. I'm enjoying myself so much.
Yeah, also Italians tend to get a bad rap, especially in the talks I've done so far. I wanted to talk the cowards they're cowards in battle. There weren't.
Yeah.
And I want this book to prove that.
The book is called The Great Italian Breakout. Listeners, go to our TRE bookstore, click on the great front cover. I absolutely love the front cover, and it'll be winging its way to you. Karen, if people want to find you online, is there a website? Do you do socials? Where can people find more about what you're up to?
I'm on Facebook and I'm on Insta under my own name, and welcome contact.
The book is called The Great Italian Breakout. Listeners, I urge you, you know how much I love my Second World War history, and I've got a huge thing for the Italian campaigns. Go forth and order it. It's called The Great Italian Breakout. It's by the wonderful Karen Farrington. Karen, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.